So okay. So based on the follow-up question, I just wanted to add the point at the beginning of the conversation because I got the impression that there was a little bit of a confusion going on between what is the service ping and what is the snowplow, or like what is the distinction between those two. And I think that it will help us to be more direct in the follow-up points in today's meeting if we clear this out. So the service ping is process that collects reports from the self-managed instances mainly. There's also the service ping for SaaS, but this is not the event level data. This is the aggregated information based on the number of rows in the database, operational database, like number of rows in the issue table, or some other information like the instance license, MD5 or SHA hash. So various information, and it all, we have roughly around 2,000 of metrics in the service ping. All of these metrics comes together as a single JSON object via HTTP post request. So it's definitely very different structure than the event-based data, which reports atomic bits of information via single event. And the second part of the conversation is Snowplow for SaaS, for GitLab.com, which reports events-based data, and it's collected and aggregated later on in the downstream systems. And yeah, those two are very independent from each other and not really compatible.
I guess since Nikolai, it's probably me that's misunderstood that, because I'm pretty sure you've explained this to me before, but I appreciate you highlighting it again, just so myself and others are aware. Is it correct in saying that like Snowplow kind of came after Service Ping, or did they kind of come around at the same time? Like you call it, basically the reason I ask is there's multiple events that are there's thousands of events being collected in Service Ping that aren't in Snowplow. Like, is there a plan to like combine those ever, or is it just kind of like whatever exists in one will stay there until, someone decides not to?
I don't have very specific insights, but I believe Service Ping was a little bit earlier than Snowplow. But also there was the main, I think, the driver for like the difference and those two tools diverging from each other was driven by the ability to report from the self-managed. And we got a lot of pushback and constructive feedback from the wider community when we try to introduce the event tracking on the instance levels. So the service ping in the aggregated form is way more privacy concerned, because it doesn't really report any information which is entitled to what is per singular user doing. Like the number of issues or the number of projects doesn't really tell us anything about the user. And also it's way smaller data stream coming from the instance. So the instance administrators feel way more in control. Like they can just browse the payload and see what is exactly going out of the instance. And with the Snowplow events, which could be millions, it's simply impossible to monitor every bit of data that's coming out. There are numbers of initiatives to bring those two data sets closer together, also driven by the fact that we have a little bit of a challenge how to replicate the service ping metrics per customer on the SaaS level, because this service ping runs on the instance level, and for the self-managed, one instance is one customer. For SaaS, that's not the case. This is thousands of customers combined together, which makes the life of customer success harder. So there are a number of initiatives that help to break down the SaaS instance into the particular namespaces which represent the customers. And for that, we're also using these Snowplow events to mirror or replicate some of the Snowplow, some of the service ping metrics, but not all. There is also an initiative which is called internal events tracking, which was recently started, where we try to provide more cohesive, like singular events API, because the confusion that you face then is well, very common among GitLab. Like we face numbers of feedbacks that people are really confused, like which events to track and like what this tool does and what the other tool does. So we started recently the initiative to bring those all tools together and provide a singular interface. But it's a very early stage, and we basically are wrapping up the groundwork to even start building on top of it.
No, thanks for that. That rings a lot of bells to what you previously explained to me, and that the method of collection. I mean, some people manually still send it as part of, like, I think their license check, service ping, some contracts for people that are in air-gapped environments, for example, or just not regularly sending them send that payload. So that's obviously a lot more of a process to figure out when we have to then start to collect millions of potentially rows of events data, things like that. So that makes sense. And I also now remember the problem with .com. That we don't have that same level of granularity, since we are a much larger instance with different cohorts of customers and things like that. So thanks for clarifying that. Cool. So I guess onto why Mikołaj clarified that is that I had a couple of questions that I really wanted to bounce off of an analytics instrumentation. There have been a few discussions that I've had with some members of analytics instrumentation, some with product analytics as well, and I kind of wanted to understand better with all of us in the room, like what's actually possible, what we can maybe move forward with, or what's not actually possible in terms of using what I thought was service ping data, which now, to correct myself, is snowplow data from .com, and then potentially use that as a way for us to instrument GitLab.com, or at least view that GitLab.com event data within product analytics dashboards. And so just trying to figure out which person and which point to refer to. I guess we can just go in order. I'll if you kind of go to 2A1 here that I'm highlighting currently in the agenda, I'm asking, is it worth potentially setting up some kind of ETL where we can grab data from, and I'll call that and clarify that to be snowplow from .com, and periodically import it into the production cluster for the purposes of using that for product analytics features with .com data that we already collect. And then Mikołaj, you have a point there.
So this was one of the first questions I looked into, and then
Yeah,
I got this all snowplow service ping confusion, suspicion. So this answer, if it's about the snowplow, it doesn't really applies, because it distinguishes the snowplow from service ping.
right.
And I think that the subject of the ETL was covered by Basti, to be down below, with suggestion to use the different endpoints and not really backport the data, but rather keep on them collecting. But I will let Basti to voice out, because I think he has more broader suggestion to share.
Cool. I'll just quickly cover my point that Basti responds to, and then I'll pass it over to Basti just for the context. So I was recalling when we had early discussions when we were wanting to implement snowplow for product analytics that we wanted to use a self-describing event schema. And part of that was because what we use on .com currently for snowplow is using an older schema. And so that was my understanding, but Basti, you've clarified it here.
Yeah, I mean, that understanding was correct. So our .com schema right now uses this, I think Snowplow calls it structured events, which is a event that always has, I think, a label, an action, a category, so a bunch of different string identifiers. And that's a kind of deprecated structure. I think that was originally inspired by Google Analytics, so it's kind of the same structure that Google Analytics uses, but Snowplow by now recommends these self-describing events and not using this old structure. I think if we would rebuild kind of Snowplow from scratch on GitLab.com, regardless of product analytics, we would also use self-describing events. So in theory, I think we could still do something like an ETL where we take the Snowplow data, so the Snowplow data from .com, it's actually running on AWS in an Amazon Kinesis pipeline, and then put into an S3 bucket. So there's a bunch of S3 buckets which just hold text files with the Snowplow data. And in theory, we could grab those and just actually transform it. I think, for example, so our custom event right now has, I think, just a name. So in theory, you could just imagine, I don't know, taking this label action something, and either putting it into specific properties or just concatenating it into a long string, and then kind of that way transforming it and ingesting that data then. at the same, and I think what's important to differentiate here is between events and page views or other like standard events within Snowplow. So there's page views, there's page pings, which tell you about kind of how long a page view has been ongoing. And there's things like link tracking. So events that are specifically sent from certain plugins that are not affected by this. These are just still, this is a like special kind of event. This is not part of this custom self-describing event thing. So page views and so on, those we could just take and like use as is in theory. But they're all part of the same big bunch of S3 buckets. So just by looking at the bucket, you couldn't differentiate between those two. And then I think, so we already thought a bit about this, and what Mikola was already referring to is this confusion by our like internal users. So people in GitLab who need to instrument an event around, okay, what kind of instrumentation do I need to use? Like, do I need to use this service ping Redis stuff? Do I need to use Snowplow? And for that reason, I think we would prefer to, what we're already right now doing is encapsulating it all in one API. So you just call one method called track event or something, and in the background, we use all those separate systems automatically. So we send things to the service ping if it's on a self-managed instance. We send things to Snowplow if it's on .com, and we would use the same API then to send events to our product analytics Ruby cluster as well. That would be our idea. And then in the beginning, we could do, just figure out a way to not send all events at once, because what's also important to consider is the amount of events we have on GitLab. So that's around 60 million events per day. Around 7 million of those are page views. And so this kind of amount, I think, also takes a toll on the infrastructure we have. So even if we would just ETL it into our system, ClickHouse would still need to be able to handle millions of events that would accrue over time. So I think we should start slowly and not send everything in at once. That might end up catastrophic.
I mean, I don't know if we have a if we have a better idea in the next coming weeks about a scaling strategy, it might be good to just test it. Just
could also be
unloading the fire hose like that. But no, I'm actually particularly interested in the fact that we have that much data coming in, so that we could actually use that for testing. It would be interesting to see. And my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, from your response here, is that we could do an ETL for old events to kind of bring in old event data into new ones, but given the recent encapsulation efforts, it might be better off just to kind of move forward with just sending new events to the product analytics clusters and just doing it that way. That way, we're not really doing any effort on kind of old data that and just kind of do it on new and still basically have the same value. And since we have enough events, it wouldn't really matter anyways.
Yeah, except if we, out of some reason, want to test our system with billions of events at once, then we could just, because all this data is available in S3 buckets still. So there's S3 buckets going back a long time. So if we, out of some reason, need billions of rows of data, we can ingest it. And we can, for example, write a script to just ingest the page views. If we are just interested in kind of looking at graphs from page views, or transform the events that are there into a structure that's feasible for us to work with. And I mean, there is also existing knowledge about kind of working with this data. So the data platform team, for example, recently wrote scripts to go through all this data to remove IP addresses. So they already had Python scripts running on the existing S3 bucket data. We could ask them for help if we somehow want to ingest that into an existing pipeline.
Also, ClickHouse has the integration with S3, as far as I know. So probably it would be possible to just connect the ClickHouse instance directly to the S3 buckets with the events files and build the whole ETL pipeline just in ClickHouse. Similar to what
that might be faster to do.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, just the same as we do with the Snowplow events right now. So queue in the ClickHouse and just
a good point. Yeah.
Build views on top of that.
Cool. Yeah, not to mention just the billion row scale, but also if we found it interesting enough that we wanted to connect historical data that we currently have with what we're collecting now, or when we do set that up. random follow-up question that's come out of that, just to understand how much historical data is still in S3. Did we ever get around to defining a data retention policy, or do we still have like basically everything that we've ever? Okay, cool. So that's interesting.
And it's all, as far as I know, it's all also in S3. So it's not only in the data warehouse, because the S3 is our actual backup of all these events in the event that the data warehouse would go down, so we could re-ingest them.
But the data is
That's
organized
very
in the date-based folders, so we don't really have to ingest all of it at once. We could just say, okay, let's go back by month, by year, whatever we decide as a fit. So we have a little bit of control how much back in the past we want to get.
Yeah, that'll be really important, because one, that'll make the process a lot easier, especially making sure we have enough space for all of it in the cluster, or we need multiple clusters, but also depending on our interest, if we really want to go back that far or not. So it's good that it's organized as such. I didn't write it down, but also action item. I'll create some, probably an epic around this and some issues to kind of pursue this further, but I appreciate Nikolai and Basti, your input on this. Sorry, I can't type, and this is why I'm terrible at taking meeting notes. Type and talk at the same time. So then I asked about using the browser SDK, but at this point, I guess, well, I think it's still relevant, because what we're looking at as far as Snowplow is specifically, well, no, we're collecting page views as well. I guess, I'm not sure if I should even mention this question, but basically the reason I asked it was that, could we use the browser SDK on .com if it were able to collect events in the same way that Snowplow currently does on .com. But Basti, to your point, that requires the use of the Kinesis pseudonymization pipeline, which would then basically be an additional part, which wouldn't really mesh well with our current flow as far as pseudonymization is concerned. So I'll maybe table this part for now, though people are happy to read through this at this point. But I think, sorry, go ahead.
I think it might still be, I mean, we have time, so I think it still might be helpful to just kind of lay out all the options, because we have this ability to either, like we said before, kind of ETL old data in, or then also new data in. But I think that's like handling this amount of data is kind of with an ETL pipeline can be also a challenge. I mean, that's just need to talk to our data platform team who handle this every day. And the alternative is to actually add these additional SDKs. And there, I think the main point is that's important to understand is that we are pseudonymizing quite a bit of stuff right now for GitLab.com, and that's written down in our kind of terms of service or something, that this data isn't collected. So kind of it would be important for us to do the same if we ever add an additional layer of collection to GitLab.com. And there is enrichers and kind of easy ways to do pseudonymization.
It's taking me months to get that word right.
With Snowplow, but mostly on specific properties. And the one thing that I think we are doing special that is not easily covered is actually looking at URLs. So because in theory in GitLab, namespaces or group names or project names, they could expose personal data, like the name of a project, the name of a, and so those are getting actually pseudonymized or something in this pipeline. And you can, I think I linked a table here, and you can see it's just like the URLs are now just like namespace 123 or something instead of the actual namespace name. And that's something we would have to implement again. I think the important part here is also that this is like in the current pipeline, it's running on Kinesis, but the part that does the conversion is a Ruby Lambda. So it's just a bunch of Ruby code. We could theoretically also try to kind of modify that to run with Kafka as well. So the actual code to do the pseudonymization probably could stay the same, because the structure of Snowplow is the same, of the Snowplow data. It's just kind of the connection between, it's a different type of connection. It's instead of doing it with Kinesis, you do it with Kafka. And there's also alternatives to kind of replicate that code because it's not that much. I mean, the actual, like taking the data pseudonymization, you could also convert that, for example, into JavaScript, which would be easy to use on as an enricher. So Snowplow has possibilities to just add JavaScript enrichers directly. So you don't need to kind of set up a different function or anything. So this would also be a possibility to do. But I mean, that the big part here is, I think, is that this is very different to what probably our customers want, because this is very specific GitLab thing. So either we would have to have a different cluster, I think, just for where GitLab data goes through, which I don't know, maybe a good idea anyway. Or alternatively, have the code in a way where it looks at, okay, is this a GitLab project? And then just do the pseudonymization. And if not, then not.
Right. So to that point, I mean, earlier we were talking about using the new encapsulation to send events to product analytics cluster, right? But we would have to re-implement the pseudonymization regardless, if I'm understanding. Yeah. So that's actually, regardless of what we do, if we want to use .com data, we need to have pseudonymization. And so if it's not happening in Kinesis, then we have to re-implement it at our level.
The one thing is, I think with the Ruby SDK, we can theoretically just choose to send data that doesn't need to be pseudonymized. As long as we don't send namespaces, user IDs, and so on, we could just start sending events without any additional user information. With the browser SDK, it's different because it's the browser, it's page views being tracked and so on. So as soon as you put that in, you're gonna send information that is potentially PII data, which we want to handle. So theoretically, on the Ruby side, we could start implementing without this being in place. On the JavaScript, like web browser side, not.
And I guess to clarify, the page view events that we currently collect through Snowplow, that's using a browser SDK, or is that collected a different way?
No, that's the Snowplow browser SDK just being implemented.
Okay, but in this case, it's being passed through Kinesis, which does a pseudonymization before. Okay.
Yeah, so we just have similar to our current cluster, like the Snowplow part and so on. This is also just set up on AWS. It's not in Kubernetes. It's like EC2 instances for the collectors, for Snowplow collectors, and instead of Kafka, it's Kinesis. But otherwise, we have kind of just a similar pipeline. It's just then not ending up in ClickHouse, but rather in these S3 buckets, which are then getting ingested into Snowflake, which is our data warehouse. So if you go through Sisense or something, you're querying Snowflake.
Around the page views, Basti, I want to specify one thing. I'm like 95% sure that the URLs pseudonymization, which you mentioned, actually happens on the server side on GitLab when the page is loaded to the browser. So the Snowplow SDK, browser SDK, is sending already pseudonymized URLs because we don't have on Kinesis the way to map the namespace ID or namespace names to the IDs. So GitLab server resolves back, so it gets the request, HTTP request, finds the namespace ID or the namespace name, project name, resolves it back to the ID, prepares pseudonymized URLs, send it with the HTML, and then from that, the URL is replaced just for Snowplow and is sent back to the pipeline.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, well, I'll create
so
initiatives.
It may open up a little bit the ability to use the browser SDK, because depending how the browser SDK is currently built right now with the page views, it may be possible to reuse these pseudonymized URLs with the browser SDK.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Yeah, I'll open an initiative for us to really outline the options we have here, because I also wonder, and I don't know, James, if I guess first we have to get out to customers so they can try it first. But Basti mentioned we're not sure if they would want this, but if we're kind of gearing for application developers and being able to pseudonymize, now I can't say it anymore, pseudonymize namespaces when they're doing it in their applications, that might actually reduce the barrier for them to actually be able to collect event data without collecting PII. So for the same reasons that we're trying to get, instrumentation set up more, maybe potentially there are customers that have a similar situation as well. But I guess which we won't know which one will have to come first before the other, but yeah, I think at any rate we would likely need a separate cluster environment for specific, which we can do now, connecting a project to a different cluster. So we could theoretically connect GitLab-org/GitLab to a separate cluster, and which would then have something to do the pseudonymization. I can say that version of it. And then later on, we can explore whether other customers would need it, and we can build it maybe actually into it for everyone. But anyways, bottom line is I'll create an issue for us to really outline this since we started getting into like technical design for it. But cool. Good discussion. Thanks everyone. I think we're at time at this point. So I think Basti and I wanted to just kind of give an overview of what's going on. Basti's already written what's happening. I will write down what's happening, and then yeah, but we're already at time. So unless there's anything anyone else would like to call out, I'll just pause for a second if anyone wants to talk about anything in the few minutes we have left. All right, well, it's good to see everyone. Thanks for the discussion, and hope everyone has a good rest of their Monday, good rest of your week, and take care.
Yeah.